All right, guys. So I didn't know that you guys know each other from before. That was an amazing coincidence.
Yeah.
So why don't you guys just introduce yourselves maybe for the audience who don't know?
My name is JJ. I started a fund called OSS Capital about 7 years ago, or 6 years ago rather. And we invest in open source companies predominantly, but we've invested in a few crypto-related things and a couple of things that are sort of open source adjacent, but very central. Yeah, we have a lot of open source investments.
And you found KubeCon.
Yeah, that was a long time ago, but that was almost a decade ago. Yeah.
Umur?
Right now, so I'm one of the founders at Ubicloud, but if I rewind the clock a little back, founded a company called Citus Data that did distributed Postgres. First closed source, we went open source. We'll talk more about it later on. Eventually got acquired by Microsoft. We had a user base both for startups, which eventually grew into large enterprises. It was there. We almost worked with JJ back at the time. JJ was a kick-ass talent back then. After the acquisition, I stayed at Microsoft, ran the Postgres team together with my co-founder there. So we did, as things shift to the cloud and shift to open source, we saw a lot of that as part of Microsoft as well. Different perspective. And then I left Microsoft to join YC as a visiting partner. So I was working the last 2 batches with a lot of YC companies, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And then I left to start Ubicloud, which is an open source alternative to AWS. So we are looking to build something big, something we really are excited about.
So both you guys have both contributed, built, and invested in open source projects. So maybe with the first question, let's start with to be or not to be an open source company, which is actually right now, both for investors and founders, a huge enigma. And so what would your suggestion be to the developer tool founders who are just starting when they are making the decision of being an open source or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very paradoxical decision because your core technology is free and anyone can fork it and compete with you and basically make it a lot harder for you to make money. And so I think when founders make this decision, I think you have to really be very clear about your business model and the degree to which you can actually create a product that you'll be able to monetize effectively. And there's like a ton of complexity in that, but that's the first thing that I would say, I guess.
Yeah, the way I think about it is the value, open source by itself is, not a competitive edge just by itself. Combined with other things, it can become a very effective competitive edge. And I think the closer your product is to developer land, the more reason you have to be open source. That's not the only reason. And it's a means of building trust. It's a means of building transparency. And not just with developers, but also with the enterprises who are worried about, like, when they say no to your dingy startup, which is at first pretty much all startups are, effectively, they're saying no for many reasons, but one of the biggest ones is they don't trust you, right? Like they don't trust you to run their critical workloads. And being open source doesn't give you that. It just gives you more credibility into that path. So that's a good reason to do it. To JJ's point, you do want to think about, okay, how things will, as you build it, how are you going to monetize it? I think that question was very kind of unanswered or, for example, at Citus, when we did go open source, a lot of investors were very skeptical. They said, okay, who's a large open source? And the only meaningful example you could point was Red Hat back then. And Umur's here, Cloudera was kind of like, well, and there's, it wasn't that open source wasn't there, but there wasn't an established proof point. They said, one proof point, Red Hat doesn't make your case. So there was a lot of skepticism. I think now we're safely past that point where you have many companies, public and private, whether Mongo or many others, I don't need to count them. But now it's very established. Investors know, customers know, and it's up to you to make people care.
Almost all the companies who are targeting developers, sometimes individuals, sometimes enterprises, they always have the open source alternative, right? You also yourself are building an AWS alternative, an open source alternative. Meta is now working on open source alternatives for LLMs, competitive they're competing with Anthropic and OpenAI. Although like these companies from a very higher level, they have the same value proposition. Their biggest maybe edge or the biggest difference is them being open source. Even right now for MongoDB, for example, they are kind of getting a little bit far away from being an open source, but now we are seeing MongoDB's open source alternatives. So for example, let's talk about Ubicloud a little bit. What is Ubicloud's edge other than being the open source alternative of AWS?
Right. Perfect question. So so what Ubicloud is we say it's an open source alternative to AWS, and the way we approach that is one of cost. Hey, that you can actually run Ubicloud, and we have a managed version of our product that costs anywhere 3x to up to 10x less than what you pay the large providers. So that's an immediate value prop. And another is portability, where hey, you can take this and you can run it anywhere you like. And there have been variants of these themes in the past. Folks who are familiar with it will know, for example, something like OpenStack, where like it's was born like many years ago. So some pieces of it have been around, but we have a very opinionated view on it, and where we built different cloud products over the better part of last 15 years. Mm-hmm. My founder Özgün was previously at Amazon before kind of his team evolved to become essentially AWS, and Daniel, who was one of the core people who built Heroku Postgres. So we've been building cloud services for many years, and we say, okay, if we take a view, when we keep it simple, we eat our own dog food and have a managed service, it gives monetization at a very low cost. I think, so for a lot of folks in the audience or startups, our main edge is why pay 3 times, to basic compute, which now is possible to use with something like Ubicloud.
Maybe from another perspective, JJ, let's assume that there's a company with the same IP, with the same value proposition. In one universe, this company is open source. In another one, it's closed source. Would your approach be different for these two companies in these universes?
I kind of think about this in a couple of different ways. If you have an open product, an open source product, and a proprietary product, and they are at feature parity, meaning they do both the same thing. They solve the same types of problems. And to the end user, what the value is that they get from the product is indistinguishable, right? So it does the same things. Fundamentally, it's offering the same amount of value. The way that I look at the world is if people were fully educated about the implications of having a technology that you could control and that you can modify and that is essentially yours. Again, in the hypothetical universe where there's feature parity and both products do the exact same thing. I can't imagine a world where the consumer would not choose the open one as long as it's as easy to use and as seamless an experience in terms of how you adopt the technology, which by the way is totally independent of, are they feature parity? Do they do the same thing? So there's a big difference between do the products do the same thing and are the products easy to use and easy to adopt? So most of the open source technologies out there are really horrible to adopt. They're very painful. They have a bad user experience. They're really crappy at design. The founders don't know how to articulate them to the market, and they're not actually built in a way, almost instantaneous for the user to get value from the product. For most open source, you have to be a programmer and you have to write some code to, basically get value from the technology. And most most proprietary technologies, on the other hand, you click a button and you get value, or you swipe a credit card and you get value. And so that's kind of the fundamental distinction.